The fog over Lorraine is thicker than smoke. It is the morning of September 20th, 1944, near the small French village of Aricourt, where elements of the U.S. 4th Armored Division wait, engines idling, 4 German armor they can barely see. Above them, just under the cloud base, a speck of fabric and tubing hunts alone. It is a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a liaison aircraft with a 65-horsepower Continental engine and a maximum speed of barely 85 miles per hour, designed to spot artillery, not survive battles with tanks. Yet along its wing struts, 6 dark tubes jut forward. They are M1 Bazooka launchers, infantry anti-tank weapons hastily bolted and wired into a crude firing circuit. In the cramped front seat sits Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, an Army observation pilot who, within weeks of arriving in combat, has turned his unarmed Grasshopper into a strike plane called Rosie the Rocketer. Below, the fog that hides the 5th Panzer Army's advancing tanks from Allied fighter bombers also conceals Carpenter's fragile aircraft until the last possible moment. In a war of steel and mass production, one 65-horsepower airplane is about to challenge German Panthers, and to understand how that became possible, we need to see the long road that brought Rosie to the sky. Before we dive into how a schoolteacher turned a paper-skinned plane into a Panzer killer, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon for more real, cinematic World War II stories. Before he was Bazooka Charlie, he was Mr. Carpenter. A quiet history teacher from Illinois, born on August 29, 1912 in Edgington, he spent the 1930s in classrooms, not cockpits. His world was textbooks and chalkboards, not tank columns and artillery. Everything tilts after December 7, 1941. Like thousands of other Americans, Carpenter watches the shock of Pearl Harbor push the United States fully into war. Within months he leaves teaching, joins the U.S. Army, and by 1942 he's in uniform, training not with schoolboys but with soldiers. His path leads to an unusual niche, the Army's air observation posts, the small liaison aircraft that would fly low and slow over the front to direct artillery fire. The aircraft he learns to trust is simple: the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a military evolution of the civilian Piper J-3 Cub. It carries 2 people, a pilot and an observer, under a plexiglass greenhouse and fabric skin. Its 65-horsepower engine can barely push it to 85 miles per hour, 137 kilometers per hour, at full throttle, with a typical range of about 225 miles and an endurance of roughly 3 hours. The L-4 is not armored. It does not carry guns. It is designed to be the battlefield's eyes, not its fists. By early 1942, the U.S. Army has already ordered around 1,600 light liaison aircraft from Piper, Taylorcraft and Stinson, committing to this new aerial role. Their job, according to doctrine, is precise: stay close to friendly lines, about 1,800 yards behind the front, and adjust artillery fire by radio. The logic is clear. Better observation, more accurate artillery, fewer shells wasted and fewer American lives lost. For a former history teacher, the fit is almost ironic. Carpenter, who once explained past battles from a blackboard, now spends his days helping shape new ones, orbiting above training ranges and later combat zones, calling corrections to guns he cannot see. The aircraft itself shapes his thinking. From the L-4's cockpit, the battlefield is not an abstract map. He sees individual platoons moving through hedgerows, convoys stalled in muddy lanes, and the thin armor roofs of tanks that look invincible from the ground. He also learns what the manuals do not emphasize: how vulnerable he is. One burst of machine gun fire could shred fabric, tubing, pilot, and engine in a heartbeat. Yet the very smallness of the L-4 makes it hard to spot, especially at low level, especially in broken terrain. As the war grinds into 1944, the U.S. Army ramps up its dependence on aircraft like his. By the end of the war, 5,413 L-4s will have been produced for U.S. forces alone, including 250 for the Navy as NE-1 and NE-2 variants. Carpenter is one of hundreds of observation pilots, but his posting will make him stand out. In the summer of 1944, after the landings in Normandy, Carpenter and his Grasshopper joined General George S. Patton's Third Army, attached to the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead often referred to later as Patton's Vanguard. His daily work now is to fly low over rapidly advancing columns, bouncing in the turbulence above French fields and narrow roads, spotting German positions and feeding target coordinates to the division's artillery battalions. The faster Patton's tanks move, the more important eyes like Carpenter's become. But speed has a downside. Supply lines stretch thin, fuel runs short, and armored spearheads push deep into territory where German counterattacks are inevitable. The terrain of Lorraine, with its fog-prone valleys and rolling fields, favors ambushes and sudden armored thrusts. From his cockpit, Carpenter sees what doctrine had not fully anticipated. Situations where artillery is too slow to shift, fighter bombers cannot fly because of weather, and yet German tanks are already moving. That gap, between what the manuals say his airplane should do and what the battlefield actually needs, is where the idea of turning a Grasshopper into a tank killer begins to take root. And to understand why one tiny liaison plane ends up hunting Panthers, we have to see the larger armored storm building around Aricourt and the Lorraine front. By September 1944, Lorraine is not a quiet backwater. It is the corridor through which General George S. Patton's Third Army is trying to break toward the German border, pushing between the Moselle and Saar rivers. The official U.S. campaign history later calls this stretch of fighting the Lorraine campaign, running from September 1 to December 18, 1944. On paper, the moment looks promising. In late August, German forces in France are shattered. Patton believes that with enough fuel he can be across the German frontier in days. One post-war analysis notes that he argued he could be inside Germany in 2 days if given about 400,000 gallons of gasoline, a tiny fraction of Allied stocks. But the Allied broad front strategy and logistical bottlenecks choke that ambition. Fuel is rationed. Ammunition and parts move slowly over wrecked roads and bridges. The Third Army enters Lorraine underpowered and stretched thin. By the time September ends, Patton's formations in the region will have suffered over 55,000 casualties, about 6,600 killed, 36,000 wounded, and 12,000 missing, along with a loss of at least 151 medium and 49 light tanks in that month alone. This is not the clean, sweeping pursuit Patton had imagined. It is a grinding contest against German counterattacks and the terrain itself. Facing him across the fields and villages is General Otto von Manschuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Tasked by the German High Command with stabilizing the front and, if possible, throwing the Americans back, 5th Panzer Army is rebuilt around newly formed panzer brigades and elements of existing armored divisions. At Aricourt, it will bring roughly 262 tanks and assault guns into the fight, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and Jagdpanzers, against the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A. The clash that follows, the Battle of Aricourt, 18 to 29 September 1944, is one of the largest armor engagements on the Western Front. Its opening days set the stage for Carpenter's most famous mission. On September 18, in deteriorating weather and thickening fog, U.S. tactical air forces struggled to locate the approaching German armor. Allied fighter bombers, so deadly in clear skies, are hamstrung by cloud and low visibility. The same fog that blinds Allied pilots also blinds German reconnaissance. With few motorized scouts and poor coordination, 5th Panzer Army's armored thrusts become a series of disjointed probes instead of a single crushing blow. In that gray, muffled world, the role of low-flying liaison aircraft becomes more critical. Fighters and medium bombers can't get down safely through the soup, but a small L-4, hugging the contours of the ground at a few hundred feet, can sometimes slip beneath the worst of the cloud. Where the big aircraft see only a blank, the Grasshopper might still pick out hedgerows, tree lines, and tanks. Aricourt soon proves how costly the battle will be. Over the course of the fighting, 5th Panzer Army will lose around 200 of its 262 tanks and assault guns, with 86 destroyed and 114 damaged. The U.S. 4th Armored Division, for its part, will lose about 41 medium tanks, 7 light tanks, and 7 tank destroyers, heavy losses for a single armored division, even if far lighter than the German toll. This is the scale of the armored storm Carpenter is flying over. The doctrine for his L4, written before these battles, imagines a fairly tidy war. The Grasshopper circles safely behind the front, the pilot radios corrections, and massed batteries pound fixed targets. Liaison pilots are not supposed to be combat heroes. They are supposed to be survivable extensions of the artillery. Lorraine in September 1944 refuses to match that script. German counterattacks crash into Patton's forward elements just as fuel runs short and supply lines thin. The fog and low cloud that should have favored Allied air power instead shield panzers at crucial moments. In these gaps, when artillery cannot shift fast enough and fighter bombers cannot find the battlefield, small, improvisational actions start to matter. From his fragile cockpit, Carpenter sees German armor closing on isolated support units, American half-tracks pinned down, columns trying to disengage in the mist. Reports of armor columns moving under the weather pile onto his map board. The question becomes brutally simple. Is he going to continue as a passive observer, or will he try to intervene with whatever weapons he can bolt to his airplane? In an army built on mass production and doctrine, one history teacher turned pilot decides that sometimes the only answer is to rewrite the rules himself, and that decision leads directly to the birth of his Bazooka plane. The idea does not arrive in a laboratory. It comes on a rough French airstrip, in a war where problems arrive faster than official solutions. By late summer 1944, Carpenter has flown dozens of missions in his L-4, watching German armor seize short-lived opportunities when artillery is slow to adjust and fighter bombers are grounded by weather. He knows his airplane's limitations by heart, a useful load of just over 500 pounds, of which his own weight and fuel already consume most. Somewhere along that strip of grass and pierced steel planking, a simple thought hardens into intent. If infantry can kill tanks with M1 or M1A1 bazookas, why can't an air observer bring those same rockets to bear from above? Each launcher weighs roughly 13 to 15 pounds empty. Each 2.36-inch M6 rocket adds another 3 to 4 pounds. 2 launchers would barely change the handling. 6 would be noticeable, but perhaps still flyable if he trims fuel and flies alone. With the help of ground crew and fellow officers, Carpenter has first 2, then 4, and finally 6 bazooka launchers clamped and bolted to the L-4's wing struts, 3 on each side. Electric firing switches are wired into a crude panel in the cockpit. There is no ballistic computer, no gun sight, only grease pencil marks on the windshield and his own judgment of angle and range. The alteration is unofficial, and well beyond what doctrine imagines. Liaison aircraft instructions emphasize survival and observation, not attack. But Carpenter's battlefield experience has already shown him the gap between doctrine and reality. When German tanks slip through the fog and artillery is too slow, someone has to act. The causal chain is clear and simple. German counterattacks create fleeting, high-value targets. Conventional air power cannot always reach them. An observation pilot, already overhead, chooses to arm his airplane rather than accept helplessness. What begins as a field expedient modification, a handful of infantry weapons bolted to a liaison plane, creates a new, if fragile, offensive tool, a tank-hunting Grasshopper that his unit soon calls Rosie the Rocketer. On paper, the duel looks absurd. A 2.36-inch heat rocket, launched from a flimsy tube on a fabric-winged airplane, versus a 45-ton Panther with sloped armor and a high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun. The Bazooka's M6 rocket is designed for infantry ranges, about 100 to 120 yards effective distance, with a shaped charge capable of penetrating roughly 3 to 4 inches, 75 to 100 millimeters, of homogeneous armor plate. Against the Panther's 80 millimeters front glacis, the weapon is marginal at best. But the tank's side armor, 40 to 50 millimeters, and even thinner on the hull and turret roof, presents real vulnerabilities if struck at the right angle. Carpenter's L-4, with a top speed of 85 miles per hour, is far slower than a fighter bomber and has no armor. Yet that very slowness, combined with tight turning ability and low stall speed, allows him to fly attack profiles that a heavier aircraft would struggle to match, curving in low along hedgerows, popping up over a ridge, then diving shallow onto the flanks or rear of a German column. The tactical equation becomes a trade. The Bazooka rocket offers limited range and modest penetration, but in exchange it gives the pilot the ability to fire from steep angles and from above, where tank armor is thinnest. The L-4 offers no protection, but it presents a tiny target, often hidden in ground clutter until the last seconds of an attack. Causally, this is a story of mismatched technologies forcing innovation. German armor is optimized for duels with other tanks and anti-tank guns, not for threats from a flimsy liaison plane armed with infantry rockets. American air doctrine is built around high-speed fighter bombers, not on turning observation aircraft into impromptu gunships. By exploiting the intersection of those blind spots, tank roofs thinly armored, liaison planes underestimated, Carpenter turns the technical limitations of his tools into an asymmetrical tactic, attack where the armor is weakest, from where the enemy expects it least. Machines do not decide to break doctrine. People do. By the time Carpenter is modifying his aircraft, he is no novice. He has flown over 100 combat missions as an artillery observer with the 4th Armored Division, directing fire in support of Patton's fast-moving spearheads. His performance earns him rapid recognition, eventually a Silver Star, Bronze Stars, and multiple air medals for courage and initiative under fire. Yet medals alone do not explain why he is willing to dive a fabric-covered airplane at tanks. Observation pilots already operate in a high-risk environment. They typically fly at 300 to 800 feet above the front line, often within range of rifles, machine guns, and light flak, with no armor and minimal self-sealing in their fuel systems. German forces, aware that these small planes adjust artillery, often fire at any Piper Cub-type aircraft on sight. To choose, on top of this, to turn the L-4 into an attack platform requires more than technical ingenuity. It demands a tolerance for risk far above what his job description requires. Unit accounts and later press coverage nickname him Bazooka Charlie, and sometimes the Mad Major, hinting at how unusual his aggressiveness seems even to fellow soldiers. The causal link here runs through morale and identity. Carpenter is a former history teacher, suddenly living in the kind of armored war he once lectured about. Where others might accept the limitations of their assignment, he appears driven by a steady conviction that his duty is not just to observe, but to act, especially when ground troops are in immediate danger. That mindset transforms the bazooka modification from a curiosity into a repeated tactic. Each successful sortie reinforces his belief that the Grasshopper can be more than a passive set of eyes. Each tank or armored car knocked out by his rockets feeds a legend that spreads through his division and into military newspapers. And as his reputation grows, so does the attention of both his own commanders and the enemy. Pressure that will shape how his improvised weapon is viewed in terms of doctrine, practicality, and fear. On the books, the Piper L-4 is a supporting actor. Army Ground Forces documents describe it as an air observation post, a flying vantage point for field artillery battalions, not a frontline weapon. Pilots are instructed to stay near friendly lines, typically within a few thousand yards, and to avoid unnecessary risks. Their value lies in keeping guns accurate, not in chasing glory. In practice, Lorraine in September 1944 shreds that neat framework. Aricourt is a fluid battlefield where the 4th Armored Division's combat commands are constantly shifting position, while elements of the 5th Panzer Army, with 262 tanks and assault guns, probe for weak points. Timelines compress. Sometimes there are only minutes between the first report of approaching armor and contact with American outposts. Artillery, even with good observers, cannot always be retargeted quickly enough. Liaison pilots like Carpenter find themselves in the middle of this tempo problem. From 300 to 500 feet up, they see German tanks forming columns behind ridgelines, or support echelons strung out on roads. Waiting to call in a full fire mission, plotting grids, confirming, adjusting, can mean that by the time shells arrive, the target has vanished or closed the range. That is where the bazooka plane becomes more than a curiosity. By carrying 6 M1 bazookas himself, Carpenter gives his L-4 a limited but immediate strike option. It does not replace artillery. It covers the gap when artillery cannot be brought to bear in time. The causal chain is stark. Doctrine assumes a relatively static front and predictable artillery cycles. The reality at Aricourt is a swirling armored battle in fog and low cloud. In that gap, Carpenter's decision to arm his aircraft bends doctrine without formally rewriting it, turning an observation post into a point-blank contingency weapon when no one else can respond fast enough. From a German tank commander's cupola, the sky is supposed to hold two main threats: fighter bombers streaking in at 300 to 400 miles per hour, and artillery spotter planes that must be driven off before they bring shells down. Early in the war, many crews regard the little Piper-type aircraft as nuisances rather than direct combatants. Their priority is the American M4 Shermans and tank destroyers ahead, not a fragile liaison plane somewhere overhead. At Aricourt, however, that perception starts to shift. On September 20, 1944, during the Battle of Aricourt, Carpenter's attack in fog is credited with knocking out 1 German armored car and 4 tanks in a single sequence of sorties, using rockets from his L-4H Rosie the Rocketer, serial 43 to 30,426. As his run of success continues, he is officially credited with 6 tanks destroyed by war's end. Post-war accounts quote Carpenter telling a Stars and Stripes correspondent that after his 5th tank kill, "Every time I show up now they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." That comment reveals a shift in enemy behavior. Tanks and accompanying infantry, once content to ignore liaison aircraft until they called artillery, now treat every Grasshopper as a potential attacker. The causal effect runs beyond the few vehicles Carpenter destroys. His attacks force German units to divert machine guns, 20 mm flak, and even main gun rounds skyward whenever a small aircraft appears. That means fewer guns focused on American tanks or infantry at critical moments. In a battle where 5th Panzer Army ultimately loses about 200 of its 262 armored vehicles in the Aricourt region, anything that disrupts German coordination, forcing crews to split attention between ground threats and an improbable enemy in a fabric cub, helps tilt the odds further toward the Americans. On the front line, Carpenter is simply a major in a beat-up liaison plane, flying low enough to see the color of French crops. Back home, he becomes something else, a symbol. News of the bazooka-armed cub travels fast. By October 1944, stories like "Charlie fights Nazi tanks in Cub armed with bazookas" appear in papers such as the New York Sun, and wire services carry his exploits across the United States. Magazines including Stars and Stripes, Liberty, and Popular Science soon echo the tale of the teacher-turned-tank buster. The numbers behind the legend remain modest in strategic terms: 6 officially credited tanks, several armored cars, and multiple soft-skinned vehicles destroyed or disabled. In the context of Aricourt, where German losses reach roughly 118 Panthers, 101 Panzer IVs, and 122 Jagdpanzers and Stu-GS in the wider region, his personal tally is a fraction of the total. But morale does not work on percentages alone. 4 soldiers in foxholes, the sight of a tiny L-4 diving at tanks with bazookas under its wings, becomes a story passed from unit to unit. For civilians reading about a history teacher from Illinois taking on Panthers in a Cub, it becomes a reassuring narrative: American ingenuity and individual courage outthinking German steel. The causal path is clear: frontline improvisation, battlefield success, press amplification, national morale boost. By the time the Lorraine campaign grinds on into winter, Bazooka Charlie is more than a man. He is an anecdote told in mess halls and living rooms, living proof that even in a war of factories and divisions, a single pilot in a 65-horsepower airplane can change the story of a battle. And the moment that fixes that story most firmly in history is still ahead, on a fog-bound morning over Aricourt, when Rosie the Rocketer dives toward German armor and the battle's turning point crystallizes around one fragile plane. The morning of September 20th, 1944 begins as a rumor. Men on the ground hear engines in the fog. Tank engines. Somewhere east of Aricourt, Panthers of 5th Panzer Army are feeling their way forward, part of the larger assault that will pit 262 German tanks and assault guns against the U.S. 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A over 10 days. 4 hours, the sky is useless. Low clouds and heavy ground fog blanket Lorraine. U.S. fighter bombers can't find targets. Even the little liaison planes struggle to see beyond the ends of their own wings. According to later U.S. Army analyses, tactical air forces on the 18 to 20 September period are unsuccessful in attempts to locate and destroy advancing German armored units because of the weather. Carpenter is already in the air in his L-4, Rosie the Rocketer, serial 43 to 30,426. He circles with his usual job in mind, spotting for artillery, while the world beneath him is reduced to shadows and the faint shapes of hedgerows. The 6 bazookas on his wing struts are, for the moment, dead weight. Near midday, the fog finally begins to thin. Visibility stretches from a few dozen yards to a few hundred. Enough. Carpenter eases Rosie lower, searching the gray distance ahead of Combat Command A's positions. Through gaps in the mist he glimpses movement: dark hulls, long guns, German tanks pushing toward 4th Armored's headquarters and support units. Below, elements of the division's service echelons and a waterpoint support crew are in trouble. German Panther tanks have pinned them, cutting off escape routes. If the Panzers break through here, they can roll into the soft rear of CCA and unravel the Aricourt defense from behind. Carpenter's options are brutally simple. He can climb, call for artillery, and hope that guns can be ranged in time through shifting fog and a maze of friend and foe. Or he can attack. He pushes the nose down. Rosie drops to just a few hundred feet, engine straining, fabric wings trembling. As he lines up on the first Panther, he is trading every advantage a pilot usually seeks: altitude, speed, distance, for one thing, angle. To the bazooka's M6 heat rocket, a Panther's 80mm frontal armor is nearly hopeless, but its thinner top armor and rear deck, around 40 to 50mm, offer a chance. He picks a tank at the rear of the column. Grease pencil marks on the windshield serve as his only sight. At perhaps 300 feet and closing, he squeezes the improvised switch. A rocket kicks from a tube under his wing, leaving a spiral of smoke in the wet air. The first shot misses. He hauls Rosie around in a tight climbing turn, skimming above the tree line, then dives again. Second pass. Another rocket. This one slams into the rear deck of a Panther. Witness accounts later describe at least one tank erupting in smoke and flame as the shaped charge bites through the thinner top armor and into fuel or ammunition. Carpenter does not stop. Through that afternoon he flies 3 sorties, firing no fewer than 16 bazooka rockets in repeated passes against the German formation, each attack a run at altitudes where rifle and machine gun fire can reach him easily. By the end of the day, ground troops credit him with knocking out 2 Panther tanks and several armored cars, and inflicting a dozen or more German casualties. The causal impact is immediate and concrete. Under fire from above, with bazooka blasts tearing into their column and American artillery beginning to engage, the German tanks pull back toward their start line instead of finishing the encirclement. U.S. sources later note that Carpenter's attacks helped force the German formation to retreat, allowing that trapped 4th Armored Waterpoint crew to escape destruction. In a battle measured in hundreds of tanks and thousands of shells, a single L-4 does not decide the campaign. But on September 20, 1944, one 65-horsepower liaison plane, armed with 6 bazookas and flown by a former history teacher, changes the outcome of a local crisis. Tanks are stopped, Americans are saved, and word begins to spread that Cubs with bazookas are no longer just spotters. The day's fighting does something else as well. It confirms, to Carpenter and to those watching from the ground, that the bazooka plane is not a stunt. It is a repeatable, if risky, tactic, and in the days that follow, his personal war against German armor will continue to escalate. The day at Aricourt does not end Carpenter's experiment. It validates it. In the official record, September 20, 1944 becomes the benchmark. 3 sorties, at least 16 bazooka rockets expended, 2 Panthers and several armored cars credited destroyed, and a trapped 4th Armored Waterpoint crew saved when the German column breaks contact and pulls back. For this, and for earlier missions, Carpenter's superiors confirm what the men on the ground already believe, that the bazooka-armed Cub is more than a stunt. The following days are no less violent. From September 21 onward, as the weather clears, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group hammer German armor whenever it can be found, while 4th Armored Division tanks and tank destroyers fight a seesaw battle through the villages and ridgelines around Aricourt. Carpenter keeps flying his L-4 in this environment, now as part of a broader web of air-ground coordination, sometimes spotting for artillery, sometimes directing fighter bombers, and whenever opportunity presents itself, rolling in with his own 6 bazookas. His personal war against armor becomes a pattern. He attacks from about 100 meters, roughly 100 yards, altitude, firing rockets at the tops and flanks of German tanks, then yanking Rosie's nose up in a steep climb, hoping to claw out of small arms range before a lucky burst finds fabric and bone. On some missions, German infantry catch him in the open. One account describes him banking around a tree to line up a shot when machine pistol fire rips into his wing, punching several 9mm bullet holes through the fabric before he can duck behind another stand of trees and escape. With each sortie, the Germans adjust. What once looked like a harmless liaison aircraft now draws concentrated fire. After his 5th tank kill, Carpenter tells a Stars and Stripes correspondent that word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit. The statement is half joke, half battlefield assessment. Enemy behavior has changed. By late 1944, he has done something almost no other observation pilot can claim. Across multiple engagements, he destroys or disables several German armored cars and is officially credited with 6 tank kills, a tally that post-war sources note includes 2 Tiger I heavy tanks, though the Tiger claim remains debated among historians. For this string of actions he accumulates decorations: Silver Star, Bronze Star, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, and earns a reputation as one of the most aggressive pilots in the European theater. The way he talks about fighting matches the way he flies. To one reporter, Carpenter sums up his philosophy in a single line: his idea of fighting a war is to attack, attack, and then attack again. That mindset explains why he keeps pressing in a machine with no armor, flying missions where a single hit could set the L-4's 65-horsepower engine or fuel system ablaze. Yet, remarkably, he is never wounded. Accounts emphasize that despite repeated low-level attacks in an unarmored plane, Carpenter completes the war without a personal injury from enemy fire, even as bullet holes accumulate in Rosie's wings and tail. The risk is not abstract. Other liaison pilots are shot down performing routine artillery spotting. Carpenter simply chooses to add tank hunting to that already dangerous job. His legend grows beyond the front line. By October 1944, wire stories like "Charlie fights Nazi tanks in Cub armed with bazookas" run in American newspapers, while Stars and Stripes, the Associated Press, Popular Science, and Liberty magazine all feature the teacher-turned-tank buster in a tiny airplane. Soldiers start calling him Bazooka Charlie and the Mad Major, and even some German veterans would later recall being warned about Cubs with rockets. On at least one mission, after smashing a German column with rocket fire, he lands his L-4 in a nearby field, picks up a discarded rifle, and personally takes 6 German soldiers prisoner, a highly unusual act for an artillery scout pilot, and another layer in the aura surrounding his name. By the time the Aracourt fighting subsides and the Lorraine campaign grinds toward winter, Carpenter's 6 tanks and many smaller kills are just one thread in a much larger tapestry of combined arms warfare. But that thread is bright: an unorthodox pilot, a modified liaison plane, and a series of attacks that force an entire panzer army to rethink what a harmless Grasshopper can do. Soon, however, the guns will fall silent, staff officers will total the losses, and historians will begin asking a different set of questions. How much did one man and one tiny airplane really change the battle, and what did their story mean in the cold arithmetic of war? In the days after Aracourt, the battlefield is no longer fog and motion. It is wrecks in fields, burnt-out tanks by hedgerows, staff tables covered in strength reports and casualty figures. On paper, the Battle of Aracourt, fought from 18 to September 29, 1944, is a clear U.S. victory. The official tallies show 5th Panzer Army committing about 262 tanks and assault guns against the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A and associated units. By the end, the Germans have lost around 200 of those vehicles, with 86 destroyed outright and 114 damaged. The Americans, in turn, lose 41 medium tanks, 7 light tanks, and 7 tank destroyers. These are not small numbers for a single armored clash. They sit inside a larger ledger, the Lorraine Campaign, from September 1 to December 18, 1944, in which Patton's Third Army sustains 55,182 combat casualties, about 6,657 killed, 36,406 wounded, and 12,119 missing, and in September 1944 alone loses 151 medium and 49 light tanks in the fighting. Later U.S. Army studies will call Lorraine the most costly and least productive of Third Army's campaigns, a reminder that tactical brilliance could exist inside an overall grind. Where, inside this brutal arithmetic, does one Piper L-4 fit? At Aracourt, historians consistently point to combined arms as the real answer. Well-trained crews from 4th Armored Division, led by officers like Bruce Clark and Creighton Abrams, used terrain, fog, and flexible tactics to ambush German brigades whose crews were less experienced and whose formations lacked organic artillery and proper reconnaissance. American artillery, firing from well-sighted batteries, repeatedly smashed German concentrations caught on roads or silhouetted on ridgelines. When the weather cleared, P-47 Thunderbolts and other fighter bombers turned exposed panzer movements into burning scrap. Yet, the detailed battle studies also show something else. On key days, the 19th and the 20th of September in particular, fog and low cloud limited high-performance aircraft, and small, low-flying liaison planes filled critical gaps. One U.S. field artillery study on Aracourt notes Major Charles Carpenter, head of the 4th Armored's Reconnaissance Aircraft Detachment, diving his L-4H on German tanks near Hill 246, at first failing to score a hit but successfully warning M-18 Hellcat crews of a threat forming on their flank. Later the same day, he returns and successfully hits 2 German tanks with rockets from about 1,500 feet. On September 20, 1944, in the episode that anchors his legend, Carpenter's Rosie the Rocketer flies 3 sorties, firing 16 bazooka rockets into German columns threatening a 4th Armored Division waterpoint and rear area support elements. Contemporary and post-war accounts credit him with knocking out an armored car and 4 tanks during this action, contributing to the decision of that German force to pull back and allowing the U.S. support units to escape. Measured against the 200 German tanks and assault guns lost in the Aracourt region, Carpenter's 6 officially credited tank kills are a small slice of the total. But the numbers alone don't show the kind of impact he had. His effect is temporal and psychological more than statistical. Temporal, He delivers firepower at moments when artillery cannot yet be shifted and fighter bombers cannot yet fly. Seconds and minutes that decide whether a support column lives or dies. Psychological. His attacks forced German units to treat every tiny liaison plane as a potential killer, diverting machine guns, light flak, and tank main guns skyward whenever a Cub appears. Frontline accounts and later summaries note that after his fifth tank kill, German troops shot with everything they had at any Grasshopper, a nervousness that did not exist before. Meanwhile, official U.S. and later historian analyses keep their focus on the broader picture. Aricourt as an example of well-coordinated American armor and artillery defeating technically superior German tanks whose brigades were poorly integrated and badly reconnoitered. But in the margins of those reports, amid the casualty figures, combat narratives, and doctrinal lessons, Major Carpenter and his bazooka-armed L4 appear as a vivid case study. How individual improvisation can reinforce, rather than replace, a larger system built on mass, training, and coordination. And as the shooting stops and campaigns move on, that same tension, between system and improvisation, between army and individual, will follow him home, into a life that almost ends in a hospital bed instead of a classroom. When the guns finally grow distant, Carpenter's war does not end in a parade. It ends in a hospital. In 1945, while still in service, he falls seriously ill. Army doctors diagnose Hodgkin's disease and give him no more than 2 years to live. Medically unfit for further combat, he receives an honorable discharge in 1946, promoted to lieutenant colonel on the way out, and leaves the army he has served since 1942. He returns, not to a base, but to a school. Back in Urbana, Illinois, Carpenter resumes work as a history teacher at Urbana High School, the same profession he held before the war. In the classroom, he is once again Mr. Carpenter, but his colleagues and students gradually learn that their teacher is the man newspapers once called Bazooka Charlie, the pilot who attacked panzers from a Piper Cub. The doctor's prognosis proves wrong. Instead of 2 years, he lives another 2 decades, teaching, raising a family, and running a summer camp in the Ozarks, according to recollections later shared by his daughter, Carol Carpenter Apaki. He finally dies on March 22, 1966, in Champaign, Illinois, at the age of 53, a quiet end far from the fog of Aricourt. For a long time, the plane that carried his legend seems to vanish. His Piper L-4H, serial 43 to 30,426, is sold as surplus after the war. By the mid-1950s, it is flying in civilian colors in Europe, first in Switzerland as HBOBK, then in Austria as OEAAB, towing gliders. In 1976, it disappears into the collections of the Österreichisches Luftfahrtmuseum at Graz Airport, stored away, its wartime identity largely forgotten. The story might have ended there, a legend detached from its artifact, if not for another chain of cause and effect decades later. In the 2010s, renewed interest in Bazooka Charlie leads researchers, including restorers and Carpenter's own family, to dig through serial numbers and museum inventories. In October 2017, they identify an L-4H at Graz as Carpenter's original plane, 43 to 30,426, the true Rosie the Rocketer. The aircraft is acquired by the Collings Foundation, shipped to the United States, and restored in La Pine, Oregon. The project takes several years. On July 4, 2020, its restoration is reported complete, with the original olive drab finish and 6 bazooka tubes once again mounted on the wing struts. Carpenter's daughter, now a graphic designer, helps recreate the nose art, Rosie the Rocketer, tying the family back to the machine. Today, Rosie stands under controlled light at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, part of the Collings Foundation's collection. Placards explain that it is the very same L-4H that flew over Aricourt in September 1944, built in early April 1944 by Piper, armed in the field with 6 M1 bazookas, and used in combat by Major Charles Carpenter. Archival work runs in parallel with the restoration. When some modern commentators question whether Carpenter's exploits have been exaggerated, his daughter begins assembling documents, wartime reports, unit histories, and press clippings. That effort leads to a full biography, Bazooka Charlie, the unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer, co-authored by James P. Busha and Carol Carpenter Apaki, published in the early 2020s. The book anchors family memory to archival evidence, helping separate verified kills and missions from later embellishment. The causal arc stretches from frontline improvisation to museum artifact. On the battlefield, Carpenter's decision to bolt 6 bazookas to a 65-horsepower liaison plane creates a small tactical tool and a large story. After the war, that story risks dissolving into myth until historians, family, and restorers track down the exact airframe, rebuild it, and publish its documented history. Now, a visitor standing beneath Rosie's wings can read those numbers. 6 tanks destroyed, multiple armored vehicles hit, hundreds of missions flown, a teacher who returned to his classroom and lived 20 extra years beyond a fatal diagnosis, and see the bazooka tubes that once fired into the fog over Lorraine. From a distance, the little aircraft still looks fragile, almost like a toy among heavy bombers and jets. Up close, it carries something heavier than armor, the record of a moment when one pilot, in one improbable machine, forced a world of tanks and massed armies to account for a single human decision to fight back. In the museum light, Rosie the Rocketer no longer shakes in turbulence or smells of fuel and cordite. Her fabric skin is clean, her 6 bazooka tubes empty, her propeller still. Nothing in her thin ribs and tubing says she once dived at panthers in the fog of September 1944, when 5th Panzer Army's tanks were hunting for the heart of Patton's 4th Armored Division. Yet that is exactly why this story endures. World War II is often told in tonnage and production figures. Thousands of Shermans, thousands of L4s, millions of shells, entire armies on the move. Against that scale, 1 liaison pilot and 6 bazookas should vanish into the noise. But they don't, because they reveal something the numbers alone can't show: how much of a mechanized war still depends on individual imagination and nerve. Carpenter did not change the outcome of the war by himself. The Battle of Aricourt was won by combined arms, tank crews using fog and ground, artillery officers firing blind through the mist, fighter-bomber pilots pouncing when the weather broke. His 6 confirmed tanks are a sliver of the 200 German armored vehicles lost in that fight. But cause and effect in war is rarely linear. His decision to arm a 65-horsepower liaison plane filled a critical gap when doctrine and weather left others blind. It forced German units to fear even the smallest speck in the sky, and it gave American soldiers on the ground a story of a teacher in a cub attacking tanks that said something profound about their side spirit. In that sense, the bazooka plane is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder that even in an age of vast machines, history still turns, at crucial moments, on the quiet resolve of one person willing to do more than they were told, in a machine that was never meant to do it.